Good evening, Julian McBain here, and tonight I am doing my 5th vlog episode, and I'll be doing it while doing Merry Mayhem, so for those of you who are more into the Entropia universe action, you can watch that and ignore what I'm saying. So, today I reached the coda, the end of 12 Rules for Life, and I'm going looking for another book. I think my next one's going to end up being 1984 by George Orwell. I think it's kind of topical these days. But as I'm listening to the last chapters, the 11th rule, which is leave kids alone when they're skateboarding or something to that effect, which is a commentary on not being overprotective. And I had driven down to see family in New Hampshire over the weekend. We had our family Christmas in January last weekend, and listened to Artemis Fowl. And listening to the ordeal that Artemis Fowl and his companions went through, they ended up in northern Russia. And I'm not going to do too much to spoil, because that's pretty much the fact that they're going is pretty much released in the very beginning of the book, so that's not a spoiler at all. But the actions between the characters reminded me a lot of the way that soldiers in the field act, and the type of brotherhood and sisterhood you find when you're under extreme forms of stress, right? So the company taking the typical hero's journey, or, well, of any ilk, right? The hero's journey is a fairly common theme in most forms of fiction, and always the company of people who are going, for lack of a better term, whether it's 6 or 12 or Fellowship of the Ring or whatever have you, they barely know each other when they start, but by the time they're done, they've grown so close they're like brothers and sisters. They're best friends. They know explicitly and implicitly that they can trust their lives to all the other members in the group, because somewhere along the lines, if there was a traitor, that traitor would have already been rooted out and killed, or would have murdered the whole party. And there's a scene in the book where our main character, Artemis, who had previously slighted another member of his party, is concerned over her health because she injured her hand, and there is some magic in it, so it was magically healed, and he's like, is your hand okay, and she slugs him in the face as vengeance over the previous slight. And that got me to thinking about this chapter, leave kids alone when they're skateboarding, because it's one of those things that we kind of try to protect our kids from, is fighting. And I understand that there's a certain social norm to it now, and I'm not trying to get overly political or anything like that, but I almost wonder, you've got the bullies that are out there, and we've got ways that we teach our kids to handle bullies, and I'm almost wondering if we're being over-aggressive in how we teach our kids to handle bullying. And I don't mean teaching them to be aggressively to fight the bully, but to avoid. We're being aggressive to have them avoid the interaction or not engage. And there are times that engagement with an opponent is inevitable. And maybe I say that because I'm a fighter. Those who participate in sports fighting are far more likely to engage with an opponent than to avoid an altercation, because not only are we confident often that we can handle ourselves even if we're outclassed, and we know we can take the hit, but there's a certain martial pride in us. And so I recognize that, and I recognize it's one of my things, is that martial pride, because I am a fighter. Now, whether it's fencing or armored combat, and I've done both, and of course I tried out Armored Combat League, which is the night fight thing that goes. We didn't use metal weapons. We were in training gear and used wooden swords, but it was all their rules, which means pretty much there weren't a whole lot of rules. So yes, I've been punched in the face. I've been headbutted with a helmeted head. I've been thrown in armor. That was a trip. That's what happens when your opponent's a jiu-jitsu or a judo black belt. And he did a judo throw on me while I was in armor, and he was in armor. But maybe it's that martial pride and that knowledge that we can handle ourselves, even if we know we're going to lose, or there's a high likelihood we're going to lose, that instills that belief in me that, now maybe we're trying to teach our kids to be almost too soft. Because the world is a harsh place. And I'm not saying that because I want it to be a hard place. It's just the way things are. You know, when shit happens, it happens. You've got to be able to adapt, react, and overcome. As I said in one of my previous vlogs, life is basically a series of traumas and the interceding period between those traumas. And sometimes the amount that a trauma affects us might in fact be affected by our hardihood as a chivalric code back in the day. And that tells you just how geeky and old-fashioned I am. The chivalric code stated hardihood was a virtue, the chivalric virtue. And I'm seriously beginning to wonder if we are making a mistake by becoming too soft. And I'm not saying that people should engage the first time someone challenges them to a fight as a kid, because, you know, schoolyard fights aren't necessarily okay. In fact, I'd say they definitely aren't. And resorting to one's fists should never be the first option. But at the same time, I do believe there is a point where it comes down to, okay, I've tried everything in my power to de-escalate this, and this isn't de-escalating. And, you know, this other kid who might be bigger than me or the same size as me is pushing me around or pushing this other kid around, and this is becoming a hazard. It's time to step in and do something and to push back. And, you know, maybe in 90% of cases that would prevent it from going any further. Maybe that would resolve a lot of the problems, and it might not. It might mean more kids coming home with bloody lips and noses, but at the same time, it'll allow them to test their limits. And I think also when you allow the kids to figure out what their limits are, they become more confident. And I can only say this from a male perspective, obviously. But I have noticed that when we're allowed to test our limits, we become more confident in who we are. We're more comfortable in our skin. And I think it's more of a human issue than anything, because I've seen women fighters who are far more confident because they know what their limits are, because they've been pushed to them and beyond. And I don't like the distinction between male fighter and female fighter, because when you step into the ring, you're just a fighter. When you're in armor and that helmet is on, it doesn't matter, male or female, you are a fighter until that helmet comes off. And most of the fighters I've met take that attitude, especially in the medieval fighting circuits, because there was a time when there was some of that sexism bullshit that went around, and thankfully there were some people there that quickly rectified it with a 3-inch stick. Well, a 2-inch stick, but it doesn't matter. 2 inches wide, around. I could tell you a story about Leg Taker, but I gotta ask permission of the person who owns Leg Taker to tell the story. But all of that kind of reminds me of one of the things that a knight would have to deal with during their knighting ceremony, and this leads back into the whole, you know, pushing your limits, understanding what your limits are. And knights traditionally was a martial profession, right? The officers of the king's army were knights, and these knights were generally the vassals of barons and other lords that had served the king in one way or another. Or it might just be the guy who had enough money to buy a horse and a suit of armor. Because let's face it, a suit of armor was damned expensive. And oftentimes, if you were a peasant and you were able to capture a knight, you ransomed that knight back, and that was your way into the nobility. You know, you'd strip the knight of his armor, you'd ransom him back to his family for a hefty fee, and you could pay your lord to be knighted, and that was your way out of poverty. And so, but anyway, the point I was going after was the whole idea of the fight and the challenge and learning what you're made of. And as a knight, when you're knighted, and I know this is true of SCA knighting ceremonies, and it's based on the history, although I think it's Norman history. So for those who are listening, keep in mind Norman history, because we base it off Norman England. So England, when it was run by the French, God help them, there was a tradition called the collay. And the collay was the final blow you had to accept unanswered or without giving challenge. And originally it was usually pretty brutal. Like, you didn't hold a weapon, but the king would deck the knight. You know, we're talking about closed fist across the face or in the chest, you know, trying to make the knight stagger. This was the last time this knight would have to take a blow without challenging the person who did it, or answering with it with their own sword. Because even the king at that point could not challenge the knight in such a manner without having it be answered by the knight's sword for honor. That's what it meant to be a peer of the king, even though most knights were actually still commoners. The respect that the knights had included that, especially in later years. So they took that last blow. And in later years, and even today, the collay is represented by the tapping of the shoulder with the sword, which was not part of the original knighting ceremony, and eventually replaced the collay. I don't know when, and I don't know why, per se, but I do know it ended up happening. Maybe one too many knights walked off the dais knighted with a broken jaw. I don't know, but that it happened. So, you know, I have to wonder if we've just gone overboard in being too soft on our kids. And I'm not saying that we should be abusive or anything like that, but when we see our kids face a challenge, and I came from the generation that had, to a certain extent, helicopter parenting, and my parents weren't like that, but there were a lot of parents of kids in my classes that were. And that helicopter parenting attitude, I think, was a mistake. And so I'm really hoping that as my generation raises our kids, Generation Z, which is the earliest members of Generation Z, are graduating now. My stepson graduates this year. Yeah, believe me, I know. I can already feel more gray hairs coming out of my head just saying it. Not even 35 yet. The idea that we may be not preparing our children for the harsh realities of life might not be doing them a service. And that really concerns me, because we've got, the next generations coming up. They may or may not be prepared for what life has out for them. And like I said, life is a series of traumas, and hopefully the majority of them have not experienced their first real trauma yet. But it's going to come, and depending on how they're raised is going to depend upon how they handle it. Which brings me to another thing that came up recently. And I'm not going to get into too many boring details. Well, it's not boring to me, but if you don't know what it is, it'll go over your head. But as a fighter, there was a lesson that was kind of drilled into me about 4 years ago by my teacher, whose title is a Don, which is the Spanish prefix for, well, in Spain it would be a knight equivalent. In England, it would be Sir. In Spain, it was a Don. And so my Don taught me this because I was struggling. Yeah, 90 ped global. Well, 89 ped global, excuse me. I'll take it. Awesome. But one of the things he taught me was, and this is one that I actually worked on for a full year. Be deliberate, be impenetrable. And as I'm progressing in my fencing and I'm learning more and I'm working with other people, and I keep, I tell my Don where I'm at and what I'm doing, because having a Don is a relationship. It's not just having a teacher. It's an actual ongoing relationship. Actually, it's a very feudal relationship, in fact, because having a Don offers with it a certain level of prestige, and in exchange, I am responsible to uphold that Don's house. But anyway, more to the point, these words have really come back, and actually it popped up in a memory on my Facebook, actually, because I wasn't thinking about it at the time, and I realized that it was very topical for right now in multiple ways, not the least of which is in fighting. And in fighting, what it really means is, when you move, know what you're going to do before you do it. Don't just lash out. Don't just randomly try things. Know what you're going to do. Have a plan. And always be planned at least 2 to 3 moves ahead. Because in all likelihood, the first strike is not going to hit. Know where you're going to be on strike number 2 and 3. And in fencing, we call it intention. Can you fight to the third intention? Because that's a very critical area. Because most people, anyone can fight to the first, because that's one strike, right? One thrust, one lunge. The second intention's a little bit more, but it's not over much. That's when I can't use a whole lot of jargon here. So it's when you go to strike and you move under the opponent's sword. We call it a disengage, and then strike a second time. Be deliberate. Know what you're going to do. Know how you're going to counteract a block or an opponent's counterattack. And then even more importantly, be impenetrable. And what that means is have a perfect defense. And so after that, I spent a whole year worrying about nothing but defense. If I had a strike, I'd take it, but even winning the match wasn't important to me overall. It was awesome if I did, and that's what I wanted. But even if I lost, as long as I was able to hold my opponent off for a certain length of time, I was satisfied with the results of the match. And just by spending that year tightening my defense, it made for a huge change in the dynamic of how I fought. And I was able to fight much more cleanly. Now, how does that kind of relate to what I was talking about before? So, be deliberate, be impenetrable. And this is something that I still struggle with in my speech. Be deliberate. Know what you're going to say, and have the facts to back it up, and be measured about it. Don't make exaggerated claims. Don't make exaggerated... don't exaggerate in your speech. When you have a point to make the point and be prepared to defend it. And that's what be impenetrable means. And I think that's one of the real failings of how we handle ourselves in society today. Regardless of what our beliefs are, and whether it's political, religious, scientific, socioeconomic, anything like that. And I'm not going to delve into my beliefs versus what your beliefs may be or anything like that, but if you're going to state you have a belief, and like I said, this is something I struggle with, and I'm reevaluating how I'm doing things because of this. Be deliberate, know what you're going to say, and know why. Be impenetrable. Be prepared and well-researched enough to defend it. Because just because you have an opinion doesn't mean it's a good opinion or a valid opinion. There are facts. And if your opinion doesn't match the facts, then there's a problem. That's all I really have to say on it, and that you can take that as shallowly or as deeply as you want. And I don't want the comment section blowing up into some political, knockdown, drag out horse shit. So just don't do it. But it also comes into things like psychology and philosophy. Because one of the types of things I've tried to do, often in my life, I find myself leading a very stoic existence. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because on the one hand, it keeps me from overextending myself into areas where I don't belong. It keeps me from overspending. It keeps me from putting my opinion where I may not have all of the facts. And even when I do have the majority of the facts, sometimes things pop up that I don't know. And I think I do, and I go back and realize I screwed up. And one of the tenets of such a belief or such a philosophy is to admit when you're wrong. And out of everything else, that is probably the most important thing. And I can't remember which rule in Peterson's book it is, but it, always tell the truth, but or at the very least, don't lie. So what comes with that is when you are wrong, you believe you're telling the truth and you find that you're wrong, be willing to admit that you screwed up. And that happened to me recently in a discussion with a good friend. And in a lot of ways, someone I look up to, especially when it comes to fighting, because we got into a debate. I stated something that I thought to be true was actually incorrect about. And so when I discovered my error, I went back and said, I will retract this. I was incorrect. And so I will cede the point because the facts state that you were correct in this fact. And I didn't necessarily like the fact that they were right, but that's not the point. The point is that you have to concede that point. Don't be obstinate in holding the line on something when the facts are against you, when it's obvious you're wrong. Because that's what we have a tendency to do that. As human beings, we have a tendency to do that. And even a year ago, I might not have gone and verified myself. And even when the verification came back, I might have been willing to try to find some justification for it. But I'm realizing that that's not the way we need to live our lives. Whoops. Oh, damn it. Stop. As I finish up this book that I'm listening to, because again, audiobook, deciding what I wanted to listen to next was really difficult. And I think 1984 came up on the list because it's one that it's a hole in my literary repertoire that needs to be filled. Like, I've read Animal Farm, which is also by George Orwell. But there are a couple of books that I have heard numerous references to from various people in philosophy and politics, including Jordan Peterson, Jonathan Pye, Dave Rubin, Brett Weinstein. So I need to fill these gaps, and one of them is 1984. And 1984 is a very obvious, dystopian possibility, and I'm pretty sure it's a fascist dystopian possibility, kind of similar to what you find in like V for Vendetta. And so that's what I'm going to do, is I'm going to go and listen to the book as I continue my routine. And maybe I'll re-listen to this one after that to kind of clear my head, to go back through what I learned. Because there's a lot to unpack in the book that I just listened to. And I can't just listen to it again because I'm not going to absorb any more out of it by doing a repeat listen immediately after the first one. And so I think I'm going to listen to 1984, and then I might re-listen to this one. And after that, Jung has a book out that is about as long as 12 Rules for Life. Charles Jung, who is a famed psychologist, and in fact, he's a very important one, who created the MBTI. And if you ever hear the words like I'm an INTJ, which are my actual MBTI scores, or in ENSF or anything like that, that 4-letter code, and it's I or E, N or something, T or F, and then it's S or J, no, P or J. I'll have to look up the whole list, and each one has its own meaning, and it's 4 dynamics in a person. And it makes up 16 generalized psychological categories, and inevitably, all humans can be divided into one of these 16 psychological profiles. And some are more like their profile than others, and this profile is subject to change, although not drastically. For instance, I used to be an INTP, and now when I take it, I'm an INTJ. And what P means is perceiving, and J means judging. And that doesn't mean that I judge everyone around me. That means that when you're perceiving, you go more on instinct, and when you're judging, you go more on facts. And that doesn't mean either one's wrong. When you go on instinct, a lot of times your instinct is based on environmental factors, where you absorb the facts and your brain processes them naturally, and you go off of that. And when I was an INTP on paper, and I might still technically be an INTP, I don't know for sure, I was largely into trying to intuit when things went wrong, and I was very in touch with when something around me wasn't right. I was in Japanese martial arts, which is a very perception-heavy type of fighting, so I have the feeling that had a large part to do with it. And now I'm more studious, things like that, even though I'm not in school and haven't been for over a decade now. Oh my god, I'm old. I feel that those little things can change over time because you change your attitudes, but it's not overnight. That took a drastic change in circumstances because I moved 2,000 miles. I went from a place where if you break down on the side of the road, you know you can find shelter, even if it's in the trees within 100 feet or 100 meters at the most, to a place where if you broke down on the side of the road, you could be stuck there for 3 days in 40 below zero with wind chill. 40 below zero before wind chill, and then there's wind chill on top of it. No, I lived in North Dakota. North Dakota, by its very nature, is an extremely dangerous place to live if you don't know what the fuck you're doing. And so I'm deciding what that next step is, because I feel that I'm on a track that's really changing the way I look at things. And so I'm really hoping to come out the other side of wherever this journey leads more enlightened, which I think is important for all of us, because life is a journey, right? We are traveling from birth to death, and we have 80, 90, 100 years to do it. And honestly, for our generation, for my generation, the millennial generation, of which I'm almost one of the oldest millennials out there, but not quite old enough to be Gen X, or I'm in that span that is now popularly called the Zen Eels, because we're kind of the crossover part of the generation. It's entirely possible with telomere lengthening therapies, things that we're developing, that we could come up with a way to extend life almost indefinitely. Of course, the problem is right now is that telomere lengthening is not a solid science. Well, we can do it, but unfortunately the things that we use the telomere lengthening is not only what would extend our life indefinitely, it's also what causes cancer. And that's not good, obviously. So we it's not a perfect science yet. You know what I'm saying? So I don't know where we're going. I don't know where we're going. I don't know where we're going to be in 20 years. I'm looking forward to it. I don't want to be there now. I'm really not relishing the idea of being 54. But I do know that great things can happen in the next 20 years. And I think those great things are going to be very important. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what we come up with. And who knows? My stated goal, and I've said it more than once, I wanted to be, and I don't think I've said it in my vlog, but I've said it more than once, and you know, I made supervisors chuckle and things like that, but I intend to live to be 150. Come hell or high water, I will find a way. Even if it's through sheer cussedness, I will find a way to live to 150. And even if I die on my 150th birthday, I will be satisfied as long as I wake up that day. You know, if I die in my sleep that night, that's fine with me. Just to prove it can be done. But I'm looking forward to seeing what happens. I really want to know. If I could look through the looking glass and find out just by, you know, looking and finding out and knowing it's coming, then that would probably sate my curiosity, or maybe it would just fire it up even more. I can't tell for sure. But I'm really looking forward, and I think one of the things that we really need to grapple with, and that this was kind of explored in Prey, and the reason I'm bringing Prey up is because I was watching Serial Overdrive play it on Twitch last night, and it's in my list of things to do vids on because Morglor gave me the game for that specific purpose. Well, actually, he gave me the game because I won one of his competitions, but I asked for that one for that specific purpose. Really, you know, we've always called space the final frontier, and maybe it is. But if it's not the final frontier, then the human mind is. And if the human mind isn't the final frontier, then space is, and they're very closely linked. Because I think that we have a lot to learn about ourselves, not only psychologically, but neurologically. What are we capable of? How far can we go? What can we do? We really don't understand ourselves as well as we should. And I think we have a long way to go. So with that, I'm going to close this out. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Hopefully I didn't lose you anywhere along the way or become, you know, offensive at any point. Please like, share, and subscribe down below. If you have any opinions based on any of this, drop a comment on me. And even if I disagree with what you say, it doesn't mean I'm trying to invalidate what you say necessarily. It means that I want to further discussion. I did run into an issue the other day regarding something that was inherently political, and I'm not going to get into it. And I disagreed with the commenter, but it wasn't for the sake of causing an argument. I wanted to actually engage in the debate. And so if you did see something that you disagreed with, engage in the debate. Throw a comment. I'll engage with you in the debate. And as long as we can remain civil and debate appropriately, I am more than happy to do that all friggin' night long. That's all I got. Thanks a lot, guys. I really appreciate it. You all have a wonderful weekend.